Okay, in this short video we're going to go through the various justifications that you can provide for a sample size for a research proposal that you may be developing. The justifications that we'll go through come from a paper written by Daniel Larkins and also included as a chapter in his free online textbook, Improving Your Statistical Inferences. Okay, let's go through the 6 key justifications. So to start off with, we have measuring the entire population. So with this justification, a researcher specifies an entire population which is finite and where it is possible, almost at least, to sample every entity within that population. This is actually a fairly applicable justification for a lot of the research that is conducted in high-level sport. Oftentimes when the population of interest is very small and you have access to it, it may actually be possible to collect data from the entire population. So for example, if you're working with a small population of top-level elite athletes and you may have access to all of them through whatever links that you may have or networks that you may have, it may indeed be possible to actually sample all of those, and therefore your inferences, or you can merely calculate descriptive statistics and that would apply to the entire population that you are wishing to draw inferences about. The second justification, and this in reality is the main justification for most research that is conducted, even if most researchers are not explicit about this being the justification for the sample size that they used, and that is resource constraints. So we're often limited in terms of the resources we have available for conducting the research that we're interested in doing. This can include both time, so the time we have available to actually collect the data before we have to complete a project. For example, your dissertation projects will be limited by time. You will only have a certain period of time with which to recruit and sample participants for your study before you have to finish it and write it up and submit it. And it may be that this sample size that you achieve due to this resource constraint is not actually large enough to be able to adequately answer the question of interest, but you have to make do with a small sample and therefore be cautious in your interpretations. It may also be the case that a researcher has a grant that they are working on and they only have access to a certain amount of money. That money may be used to access and recruit participants, and therefore because they only have a finite amount they can only recruit a certain number of participants. Or it may just be that you are logistically constrained in terms of the access that you have to a population that you wish to sample from. All of these different types of resource constraints can limit the sample size that you achieve. Now, in a separate video, we'll go through some of the additional things that you can consider as to whether or not a resource constraint justification is appropriate. Oftentimes when we're constrained by resources, it's worth taking a moment to think, is it even worth doing the study if we may not be able to actually conduct the study with an adequate sample size to either estimate parameters or test hypotheses adequately. The next justification then moves on to what I just mentioned, which is accuracy. So some researchers may wish to describe parameters from a sample or parameters that are estimated from a sample from a population with a sufficient degree of accuracy. So that may be the width on a confidence interval or on a standard error for an estimate, or if in Bayesian analysis, the width of the credible interval. And so the researcher is interested in making sure that they have a sample size that is adequate to allow them to achieve a sufficient degree of precision, that is, to reduce the degree of uncertainty that they have in their estimates of the parameters of interest. Related to this, albeit instead of focused on that kind of descriptive estimation task, we have what is known as an a priori power analysis. Now, in a separate video in the previous week's content, Daniel Larkins again talked through the issues of type 1 and type 2 errors and the use of null hypothesis significance testing in particular. And this is something where we are interested in making sure that we have a sufficient amount of power such that if there indeed is a true effect, that we will be able to actually detect it. And so an a priori power analysis considers what effect size that we're interested in. It considers what degree of type 2 and type 1 errors that we're happy to accept, and then determines from that the sample size that we would need to make sure that we control our type 1 and type 2 error rates and are able to detect certain effect sizes if indeed those effect sizes are actually present in the data or present in the population that we're drawing inferences regarding. Finally, not finally, almost finally, we have heuristics, and this is also another common justification that researchers provide. So, for example, it may be based on the typical sample sizes in previous literature, or some sort of rule or norm that's been described. This is actually very, very common, and in fact, if you look at the majority of, for example, intervention research in sport and exercise science, or in sports therapy and other related fields, you'll find sample sizes are typically around 10 participants per group. And this is partly due to a combination of resource constraints. It's difficult to recruit large sample sizes for these kinds of studies, albeit not impossible. It just takes some time and effort to do. And the fact that everyone seems to publish studies with these sorts of sample sizes, the community tends to have sort of accepted that this is okay. It's of course questionable whether this is or not, because these sample sizes are dependent upon the types of effect sizes that we want to detect with certain error rates, or the precision that we want to estimate our parameters at. And so the heuristic and the resource constraints in our field tend to combine to mean that we have a lot of relatively small sample studies that may not have a sufficient degree of precision on their estimates, or have very low power to detect the effect sizes that may be of interest. And lastly, is to say that you could have no justification at all. So a researcher may just report a sample size, not have a specific inferential goal, and just say, we had access to this data, this is how much we got, and this is what it looks like. And so this is fine in some cases, to be honest about this and transparent about this. Now, there's one bonus thing I want to provide here as well, because the two goals of accuracy and a priori power analysis are based on statistical inference and aimed at the use of quantitative data, so in quantitative research. But of course, we may be conducting qualitative research, as we covered in a previous week as well. And so the justifications for the type of for the sample size that we use for qualitative research may need to have a different consideration. So this consideration is often something called saturation. So in qualitative research, as we went through, we often use that data to draw out codes that relate to different themes, for example, if we're conducting a thematic analysis. And so with qualitative research, we may determine the sample size based on this concept of saturation, which is whereby we find that adding new observations or sampling new participants, recruiting new participants to our study, does not yield any new information. We're not producing any additional codes, we're not highlighting, identifying any new themes. And so within qualitative research, often what happens is we stop recruiting once it seems as though we have saturated the number of themes in the data. So these are the various different sample size justifications that you can use, and it's worth thinking about these in the context of your dissertation. For those of you who are conducting quantitative research, it's normally the case that you will, in an ideal setting, want to try and determine your sample size during your proposal based on some degree of accuracy or, for example, a power analysis. In the workshop, we'll actually go through this idea of conducting a power analysis for your research proposals and different study designs. If you're doing qualitative research, then you may want to consider proposing saturation as being the guiding principle for the sample size that you use, the justification for the sample size that you will obtain. But in reality, when you come around to completing your dissertation, you will often find that the resource constraints are the primary justification for the sample size that you achieve. And so when you write up your dissertation, it's often worth being honest about this and transparent about this, and highlighting the sample size that you intended to try and achieve based on your proposal, and the sample size that you actually achieved, and then considering this when it comes to interpreting your data and drawing your conclusions from it.